built a fire, and welcomed us all because it was raining and it was cold. The best estimates I could find was this happened sometime in October. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he went to put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself to his hand. Boy, is Paul the luckiest guy. Everywhere he turns, he just gets off a shipwreck, and now he's got a viper. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from Paul's hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer. For though he escaped the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live." They expect Paul to die real soon. They've seen this happen a lot of times. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected to see him swell up or suddenly fall dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their mind. And they said, "Well, he must be a god." I've never seen anybody rise from murderer to God in 30 minutes like Paul did here. It's lucky that God gave him that thorn in the flesh so he didn't get conceited. Verse 7, there was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home, and he showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways. When we were ready to set sail, they furnished us with all the supplies that we needed. So let's bow our heads and ask God to come join us again today one more time. Father in heaven, I just thank you again for the wonderful music we had today. Thank you for this day where we could all gather. Thank you for this building. And most of all, thank you for sending your Son to reconcile us to you. Father, I ask you to knock me out of the way today. Come down here and speak through me. We've had a great service so far. Let's finish it off with your word, not mine. Finish it off. Open everyone's hearts, including me, our hearts, our minds, our ears, and to hear your word today. And I ask this in the name of the greatest name above all names, Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay. All right. Our study's in Acts today, but I want to start out with a little thought, a promise that Jesus made. In Matthew chapter 4, when Jesus was calling Peter and Andrew, he said this. He said, come follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men. He made a promise. He said, if you follow me, I will make you fishers of men. So I ask us today as we hear this message to look within ourselves, look individually and as a congregation. If we really think we're walking with Jesus, he promised that we would be fishers of men. Do you have a burning desire in your heart to fish for men, to bring them to know Christ, to give them this good news, this news of salvation? Do you have a burning desire within yourself? Is there someone in your life you're trying to lead to Christ right now, not just with words, but maybe with prayers, maybe with your actions? So as we go through the message today, that's what I really want to talk about, because as individuals, we need to be doing that. But man, when we do it collectively, when we're all on the same page, like in the book of Acts, where we're all working together with the same goal, anything's possible. Anything's possible. And God will be with us. God loves a gathering. Remember, when 2 or 3 or more are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst. Okay, before we can really understand everything that I just read, sounds pretty simple though, doesn't it? Paul gets on an island, he gets bit by a snake, then he heals some people. Sounds kind of simple, but there's a lot of stuff in this text. And so I want to give you a quick Chris Berman, ESPN type highlight reel of a few things that happened just before chapter 28. So if we go back to chapter 23, Paul says that the Lord drew near to Paul and told him, just as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you will testify about me, you shall testify about me in Rome. Then in chapter 25, he's on trial in front of Festus, and he says, you know what, I appeal to Caesar. So now he has to go to Rome. Chapter 26, King Agrippa shows up. And Festus isn't quite sure what to do with Paul. He said, Agrippa, would you listen to Paul with me? So they brought Paul out again and listened to Paul. And, chapter 26. Paul, this is Paul. This is why I love Paul so much. Fishing for men. Talk about fishing for men. Chapter 26, if you read it, he gives his testimony. He pours it out. He evangelizes. He's there kind of on trial in front of Festus and Agrippa and all the other people. But here he is, surrounded by people that don't know Jesus. So guess what he does? He gives his testimony, and he evangelizes all through chapter 26. And in verse 28, even King Agrippa says to him, he said, Paul, you think you can convert me to a Christian so quickly? And Paul says, if I could just not only convert you, but everybody else in this room, because his heart burned so much for every soul that he was around. verse 27, so that ends. In verse 27, they say, oh, off to Rome you go. So Paul gets on a ship ride, and do we have that map, Austin, that we can show? In verses 1 through 9, they're in Caesarea, and they're trying to get to Rome, which is north of Malta. But as you can see, as we're going to find out in verse 1, they end up in Malta. As they were trying to travel in the first 9 verses, like I said, it's fall. The winds are starting to pick up. Things get heavy, so they keep getting blown off track. And by verse 10, Paul tells them that, hey, I foresee disaster coming for us. So I don't think we should go on this voyage. And I can understand why they said, Paul, you're a prisoner. You're not the captain of the ship. Sit down, be quiet. We're going on with the voyage. But by verse 14, I think they're wishing they would have listened to Paul. I better not change pages yet. In verse 14, a hurricane-force wind called the nor'easter comes, and it starts driving them across the sea. By verse 20 of chapter 27, Luke writes, we didn't see any stars or any sun for many days. We gave up all hope of being saved. They thought they were dead. I don't think Paul did. I think Luke might have been writing about himself and the other 274, but I don't think he was writing about Paul. We're going to find out why. But by verse 23, it says Paul encourages the men. He says, an angel of my God that I serve appeared to me last night and told me that not one of us will die on this trip. We will all live. And the angel also reminded Paul, you're going to Rome to testify in front of Caesar. So Paul had another assurance. In total, we find out at the end of this chapter 27, there was 276 on board. We had Luke and Paul and 274 others. They crash off the island of Malta. They don't crash on shore. They're out there a ways. So everybody that's there has to get wet. And they're floating in on boards, and some are swimming to get to shore. Now remember, it's raining and cold. So this is where chapter 28 picks up after this difficult, not Carnival cruise ride. This was a bad situation. Many days without moon or stars or sun, just being beaten around in the ocean. Don't know where you're going to end up. So here we are, back to chapter 28 and verse 1. So right off the bat, we see Luke says, once safely on shore. So now we know why Luke says once safely on shore. We found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. Remember, Luke's writing this. He's looking back on this, and this is how he feels about these people. They showed us an unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. So these people have been beaten up on this ship ride. They're wet, their clothes are wet, they're cold. The islanders saw they had an immediate need for heat and shelter. And as we read there, that the islanders started to build them a fire. And I just wanted to talk about that. The islanders perceived the needs of these people. Their needs were physical. They were heat and warmth. But I'm hoping for a shipwreck, as a couple of us have alluded to. I'm hoping for a shipwreck out here on landlocked 41st and Francis 2 weeks from today. And I'm going to talk specifically how we're going to make that happen at the end of this message. But we're going to need to be able to perceive the needs of those who come here when they come. If we're not ready for them, will God even send them? So let's take a look at what Jesus said. Now, Luke describes these people as unusually kind. If people come to our church and they say, well, yeah, they were kind, they were nice, they were nice people, they were maybe even unusually kind, that's nice. That's a nice compliment Luke gave to those people. But that's not exactly what we're called to do. When people come here, they shouldn't necessarily leave saying, oh yeah, they were kind, they were nice, because we can find a lot of kindness and a lot of niceness in places. When they come here, though, we're called to something a little bit different. We're Christians. We're called to love God. We're called to love our neighbor. We're called to love our enemy. This is a little different than most of society is. So in John chapter 13, he kind of sums it up for us where we need to be when these visitors come to our church. In John chapter 13, he said, they will know if you are my disciples by the way you love one another. They will know. Jesus said, they will know. Let that sink in for a minute. They will know. They will know that we're Jesus' disciples by the way we love one another. Moms and dads, your children will know if you really are Christ's disciples by the way you love one another. Brothers and sisters here, don't be fooled. People won't often say to your face, but Jesus said they will know if you're truly my disciples by the way you love one another. They will know, he said. And as a congregation as the whole, when the people show up, oh, they'll know. They'll know if we're just nice, kind people, or they'll know that we have the love of Christ in us. Just keep that in mind. They will know. If the love of Christ is not in you, pray for it, ask for it, because people know. Jesus said, people know. They will know. So maybe nobody confronts you. Maybe you're wearing a cross necklace, or you got tattoos of Bible verses and crosses on yourself. I don't know. But if they don't see the love in you, they will know. They might not say anything, but they'll know. So the one thing I want to just bring up real quick before we move on to verse 3 is, in preparation for this day of 9/9/19, I don't know of any dislike, any annoyance, any grudges anyone has in here against anyone, so I don't say this for any particular reason. But if you have one, this is kind of what we talked about this morning in Sunday school. If you have an annoyance, a grudge, a dislike for somebody here, we're called to forgive 70 times 7. That's another difference between us. We need to be set apart. People need to see a difference. Call out to God. Ask for forgiveness if you have something against your brother or your sister in this church. So when people come, all they see is love. They don't see any grudges. And like I said, I don't know that we have any here, but if you do, only you know if you're annoyed with somebody or you don't like them. If you are, take it to God. If you need to, go to that person. Talk to them. Work it out. But we've got it. When people come, when God provides, we need to be able to have them walk away saying, wow, gee, those people really love each other. And man, they loved me when I was there. That's what we're called to do. So we're going to go on to verse 3, which is my favorite verse in this section. It's the most exciting verse, and this is where my title of my message comes from today. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper driven out by the heat fastened itself to his hand. I had some real fun Friday night with Henry. There he is, Henry and Chris. My title of this message, as you might see, is called "The Snake Almost Hid the Gathering." They couldn't figure out what I was talking about. It's a little bit of a play on words, but the reason I tell you this is the most exciting part of this verse you might think is the snake that Paul's got hanging from his hand, but to me that's not exciting at all compared to what the first half of the verse says. Verse 3, it says, Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, the snake bit him. But see, most people will read that Paul picked up some brushwood, no big deal. Read on that, ooh, a snake bit him on the hand. Let me get on to verse 4 and see what verse 4 says. But if you focus too much on the snake, you miss the gathering that Paul was doing. The most important part of this message, where Paul's setting an example for us on how we should live. Let me back up a little bit. Remember, Paul's soaking wet, just like everybody else on this ship. Paul's soaking wet. He's cold too. These unusually kind islanders are building a fire for everyone. A big fire because there's 275 people, 276, that need to get around the fire. But there's actually only 275 because Paul's not by the fire. Paul gets off this ship, and look at Paul. Remember when I preached on the Philippian jailer? Here's Paul in shackles and stocks, and his legs are being stretched in pain, but what's he doing? Singing praises to God because he's in a prison surrounded by people that don't know Christ. Then we read in this chapter, here he is in front of King Agrippa and Festus, and what's Paul doing? He's evangelizing his tail off to these guys, and Agrippa says, you think you can convert me? And then on this boat ride, we didn't get to read it all, but in chapter 27, he warns them not to go. They go, and then he starts leading the ship about halfway through chapter 27. He's the spiritual leader of the ship. I forgot to tell you, in chapter 27, they hadn't eaten for 2 weeks at one point. They were so stressed out on that ship ride, they thought they were going to die. Nobody could eat. And Paul said, you've got to eat. He gave thanks to God, broke bread, and it said they were encouraged. He was evangelizing on the ship, so there's just no rest for Paul. He gets off this boat ride. He's freezing cold. He sees an island full of people. And he said, oh, man, back to work I go. Freezing and cold. I'd love to go stand by that fire, but guess what? I'm a Christian. I have to be set apart. I need to get these people's attention right away. So I'm not going to go stand by the fire like everybody else. I'm going to start working. I'm going to start collecting things. Now, this is nothing new for Paul. This is estimated to have happened about 59 AD is when this shipwreck happened. Best estimates I could find. There's some varying times. But then also, 2 Thessalonians is estimated to be written about 51 AD, so about 8 years earlier. Now remember, when he wrote 2 Thessalonians, he'd already been there, so this is past when he was there. So a decade earlier, Paul writes to the people in Thessalonica, he writes, when I was with you, did I not labor and toil day and night so that I wasn't a burden to you? Did I just come there and take what you offered, take the food and tell you about Jesus and kind of mooch off you? No, I worked not only did I work, I labored and toiled the whole time. This is nothing new for Paul. He realizes that God works, and he has to work. He has to set an example. His behavior has to be so flawless, because he knows from Galatia and all these places that he's been that if his behavior isn't impeccable, somebody will come from behind, somebody will come behind him and try to undo the work he did, as we saw in many of his letters when he had to write back, "Oh, foolish Galatians, how quickly you've tried to change the message I gave you," right, Russ? Russ is preaching in Galatians. So he's got to have, so when he's gone, he needs those people to look back and say, you know what? We can't find a flaw in his character. The guy worked the whole time he was here. He preached. He loved us. You know, when these other people come and they start asking for money and they start doing these things, Paul says, I don't want you to undo my work. And he's hoping for a chance to evangelize to these people. So he's out there working right away. And I just think that's the most exciting part of the verse. If you focus on the snake bite, you miss that excitement. And I just wanted to also say in Colossians, this is something for us to think about. In Colossians chapter 4, in verse 5, Paul says, be wise. Make the most of every opportunity with outsiders. If somebody's not a Christian, make the most of it. Be careful with what you say. He implies their soul hangs in the balance, because if you claim to profess Christ but you don't live it, he says you're hurting their chance for salvation. All right, so now we'll talk about the second half of the verse real quick about the snake. So here's this sneaky snake. I'm going to do a little Bob Ross painting here. So remember, Paul's wet. He's cold. There's 275 people standing around this fire. Paul's been working. He comes up. He's got an armful of brushwood that he wants to throw on the fire. Now, it's going to be a hard, it's a big fire, obviously. But 275 people gathered around the fire trying to get as close as they can because they're freezing cold. They're getting as close as they can, I'm imagining, without getting burned, trying to get warm. So Paul comes up, excuse me. I think he has to say excuse me because I don't think there's much room available around the fire. What do you think, Deb? A lot of room openings? No, I think it's tight. So Paul's got to come up and he's got to, excuse me, I got some wood. I'm gonna heat up the fire a little bit. Excuse me. Probably gets a couple dirty looks, but then eventually throws his wood in the fire. So 1 second Paul was there. 1 second. He's up there throwing the wood in. And he gets bit by the snake. These other men have been standing around that fire for how many minutes? What's the odds of that? What do you think the odds of that are, Dewey? He's there for a second. Everybody else has been there for several minutes, and he's the one that gets bit. I think we have a strategic God that saw Paul out working, trying to get some credibility with these people, and God said, oh, okay, you want some credibility? I think he allowed something to happen there. Let's go on to verse 4. We'll see how that plays out in a second. Verse 4, when the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, so guess what? They saw it. They saw Paul standing there with the snake on his hand. It says it right there in verse 4. They said to each other, this man must be a murderer. Boy, they were quick to rush to judgment on him. For though he escaped the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live. They got a little bit of spirituality going there, don't they? A little bit of karma. Goddess Justice is going to take Paul down. You know, sometimes people rush to judgment about us too, about Christians, because they've had a little experience with them in the past, or they went to a church for a little while and things didn't go good. And sometimes they don't want to come back. So as we go out and ask God here over the next couple weeks to bring these people to our church, we need to keep in mind that sometimes they've already made quick judgments about us. And we need to be aware of that. Let's look and see verse 5, what Paul did with this judgment that people had made about him. Verse 5. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and didn't suffer any ill effects. I want to suggest that when people get on our case and people get us down, that we learn how to shake it off real quick. We hear that term in sports a lot for golfers, for instance. Right, Cliff? You're a golfer. You make a bad shot, shake it off. Forget about it. Move on to the next one. Well, I want to go back to my Bob Ross painting that I was doing. Everybody knows who Bob Ross is, right? Mr. Puffy Cloud. He's the one that's real soft-spoken. Let's put a puffy cloud over here. And anyway, he's a great artist if you've never seen him. So anyway, Paul's standing there, and he gets bit by the snake. Here he is standing there. The light of this big fire is glowing. It says the islanders see him. It says Paul shook the snake off. I imagine Paul was startled. I would be startled if I'm throwing wood in. All of a sudden I get bit by a snake. I'd be startled. But I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if Paul didn't say, he got startled, but then he said, and he held it up for a little bit. Didn't just shake it off immediately. I don't know. I'm just supposing here. I'll tell you why I think that in a minute. But Paul gets the snake. It says he shook it off. He just let it go. Back in the fire. Psst, goodbye, snake. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how we can shake things off when things look bad. So Paul is standing there. He's snake bitten. Sometimes we're snake bitten. And why do I think that Paul might have even relished in the snake bite a little bit? Because I think Paul was working. He wanted to be set apart. And this snake bite got their attention and set him apart. But I don't think Paul was worried at all about the venom, the snake bite. Anybody know why Paul wasn't worried? That's right. Paul had promises. Remember back in Acts chapter 23, the Lord stood near Paul and he said, you shall testify about me in Rome. And then in chapter 27, he said, you will testify about me in front of Caesar. You will be in Rome. So I wouldn't be surprised if Paul stood there and said, yeah, see everybody? I'm not saying he did this, but I can almost imagine, because see, this helped his case. This helped get the islanders' attention. And when I read this, I wondered, when we're snake bitten, when others mistreat us, when we're in pain, when we're running low on funds, when we're in trouble, when our kids are in trouble, when we have kids that don't know Christ and we're panicked almost, praying to God, asking God, help God, lead my son, lead my daughter back to Christ. When we're going through these things, when we're snake bitten, do we have any promises like Paul did that we can stand on? That's what I thought of when I read this text. And I started thinking, the first one that came to mind was in Deuteronomy chapter 31, I will never leave you or forsake you. Then I started thinking in Psalm 46, it says, I'm ever present. I'm an ever-present help in times of trouble. Then I started thinking of Jeremiah 29, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And then my mind raced over to Romans 8, and in all things we know that God, what? He works. Like Paul, God works all things, not some things or every other thing or a few things. He works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And Jesus also said, don't be surprised when you have trouble in this world. Don't be surprised when you're bit by a snake. But take heart, because I have overcome the world. So I ask us today, do we have any promises that we can stand on? I'm going to give you one more verse. Paul was so confident that he had promises to stand on that he actually said, I'm convinced. I'm so convinced, for I am convinced that neither life nor death, neither angels nor demons, neither present nor future, nor any power, neither height nor depth, nor anything in all creation can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. He was that confident. He said, I'm convinced. And I think we see Paul living convinced. So we can either walk on the promises that have been made to us, or we can, when Jesus says, feed the people, we can think, well, we've got a church that's got no AC down in the fellowship hall. We got a leaky roof. We don't even have a pastor, Lord. We don't have a lot of things right now. Feed the people, I said. All 5,000 of them. With what? Go out and get what you got. Go find what you got. Well, Lord, we only found 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. That's all we've got. He said, give me what you've got. Give me the little bit that you think you have, and see what happens. Remember in 2 Kings, the prophet Elisha, he ran into the widow. Remember the widow that had a debt because her husband died and they were going to take her 2 sons away? Remember that story, anybody? And what did she ran to the man of God, the prophet Elisha, and she said, what do I do? She explained the story, and he said, what do you got? She said, I got a half a jar of olive oil. He said, okay. Send your sons out to gather. Send your sons out all over the neighborhood. Ask friends, family, ask anybody you can ask. Get every container you can get and bring them back here. Go out on faith. Go out and find it all. Bring it back here. And so the boys went out and found everything they could find, every container they could find. And when they brought them back and put them before, Elisha said, pour. And she started pouring. And every container was filled. And by the time she was done with the last container, the olive oil ran out. What's God telling us with this? He's saying, I don't care how little you think you have. You take the little bit that you've got, Josh, and you add it to me, and you're going to have 12 baskets of leftovers. Just include me in it. You've already got people. Every person in here has already got what they need to serve God. He equipped us for that. This church already has everything it needs. We've got more than Angel Morales. How do I know that there's a there's the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Angel Morales, Cliff brought him here. He told us, this is a man who's about my age, but gave his heart to God a couple years ago, and God transplanted him from Missouri. He quit a high-paying job and came up here, and he's been walking around this neighborhood knocking on doors. He's got a church of about 40 people. Isn't that about right, Cliff? About 40 people? I don't know how many people are here today, but he's right on our heels, and he doesn't have a building. He said there's a need. He confirmed what Jesus told us, that there is a harvest right here. It's here, but are the workers here? Jesus said the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. All right, we're winding down here. I know we're running a little behind, but verse 6, we're going to move on. The last few verses go much faster than the first. Verse 6, the people expected to see Paul swell up or suddenly fall dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said that Paul must be a god. See, if we can get the people to come here and see us, maybe after they come for a long time, maybe after they look at us, despite the fact that in the past they've had bad experiences in church or with other Christians in their life, maybe if they come here and they inspect us like they watched Paul, maybe they'll change their minds. We'll just see, but we have to call them first. Verse 7, there was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us all to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father, though, was sick, in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer, ready, Fred? And after prayer, and after prayer, and after prayer, and after prayer, after prayer. Did you guys know I have a stuttering problem? All right, here I do. After Paul prayed, after he prayed, he placed his hands on him, and he healed him. He prayed first. When this had happened, verse 9, when this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. Anybody catch that? When they saw God's work, when they saw the healing hand of God, when they saw Publius' father healed, the rest of them came. The rest of them came. When they see a transformation in your life, when they see a transformation in anyone's life, a real Christ-like transformation, they may not come right away. They may watch you for a long time, but when they see a Christ-like healing, a Christ-like transformation, they'll come. They'll come. That's how you build a church right there. You have people inside that are so transformed that they draw people. Like I want to use Josh Thompson for an example. I don't know how many years ago it was that somebody threw some gasoline on Josh Thompson and lit a match and threw it at him, and he was on fire for the Lord. And Josh kind of really worked in this church for doing a lot of stuff. And I used to sit back there about where Chris is sitting for years, and I'd watch Jan Thompson and Marcia Thompson sit there with a lot of grandkids, and nothing against Josh and Jake and all those guys. I mean, they were at that age where you're out having fun, I think. And, well, they weren't here. All I can say is they weren't here. And I used to watch Jan and Marcia sit there with those grandkids, and all of a sudden Josh got on fire for the Lord. And I came back. I took a little time off from this church myself, and when I came back, I was sitting about where Chris was one Sunday, and I looked, and there's Jan, there's Marcia, there's Jake and his wife, there's Jana and her husband, there's Josh and his wife. All 5 of them were there with their spouses if they had one. The whole family was there. So see, when they saw something in Josh, I think, next thing you know, that whole family was here. See, this is so important. I don't know if you've got family members that aren't following the Lord, but if you show them a genuine transformation every day, I know some people are going to, some of your kids are older, they've moved out. It's hard to be in contact with them. But stay at the prayer. Stay at showing them your healing, and eventually it'll break through. I believe it'll break through. So here's the reason I think I was called to preach this message today, because I think God's asking this church for something right now. I believe he's asking us to do something for the next 2 weeks, and this is going to be good for us as individuals, and it could be super great for us as a church. Remember I said after prayer about 20 times? I believe for the next 2 weeks, God has a homework assignment for you. I think he wants to teach you how to walk in his spirit if you don't know how to do that. If you do, that's great. If you don't, I think he wants to teach you. For the next 2 weeks, pray every chance you get. Pray, say, God, show me. Show me who it is that you want me to bring to the Bring a Friend picnic. I know this sounds silly, it sounds simple, but this is our chance to show God that we're fishing for men. We're fishing for men. It gives you a chance as individuals to go out and see what God can do through you. This isn't something to just pray once tonight or pray Monday morning. Pray every chance you can over the next 2 weeks. This is an important part of this message, and I know we're getting near the end, but I just encourage you to really take this seriously. Pray and ask God who it is that he's strategically put in your life for you to ask to bring here. I mean, ask anybody that you feel like asking, but look, and if you're really lucky, maybe God will point you at somebody that you never suspected. And then you'll be able to see what God can do through you. This is your chance. People say, well, I don't know how to walk in the Spirit like Paul did. Prayer. Prayer, open eyes, open ears, and open heart. As you walk around the next 2 weeks praying, also walk around with your eyes open, with your heart open, saying, God, show me who it is. The other day I was at Subway, and I got some food, and I went to sit down, and there was a guy sitting at a table. He had WWJD on his arm and a bunch of crosses, and when I walked by him, I said, hey, how you doing? I said, looks like you're a Christian. He said, yeah, I am. I said, do you have a church that you go to regularly? He said, no. I said, oh, really? I said, well, I got one for you. So I was telling him that I was preaching this Sunday at this church, and he seemed excited. He said, hey, I'm gonna come. I said, okay. And they said, oh, I don't think he was playing with me. I think he really wanted to, but he said, you know what, I have to work a double this week. He works overnight shift, so he had to work a double this Sunday. But he gave me his information, his phone number, and he said, you know what, I told him I'm going to videotape the message and I'll send it to you. So he said he wanted it, and hopefully we can get him here. His name is Patrick, and in case you do watch the video, Patrick, I'm talking about you. Come and join us, Patrick. God hasn't let you go. We're still after you. So just for the next 2 weeks, I don't care if you're at Subway, if you're at work, friends, family, neighbors, neighborhood, maybe you're out taking the trash, and there's that neighbor you don't like, and all of a sudden the Holy Spirit will come over you and say, that's him. Go over there, Adam, and ask him. And you're like, no, not that guy. No. But you got to be obedient. God says, you be obedient. Let me worry about the outcome. We worry about obedience. He worries about the outcome. Trust him. Go do what he asks. And one last thing as we go. I brought this picture up here because this church is 122 years old, I think. Is that right? Does anybody know? That's exactly right. The earliest date I found was 1896. This picture was taken in May of 1927. See their goofy clothes and stuff? I say that jokingly because I'd like to see us, if we really prayed, not just for these next 2 weeks, but really focus these next 2 weeks on praying and asking God who he's going to show you to bring to this church. Ask him who he's going to show you. Let him show you what he can do through you. And just maybe, in 122 years, somebody will be standing up here holding a picture of us, and they'll be making fun of our clothes, saying, look how goofy those guys dressed. You know? I'd like to, a year from now, take a picture of all of us outside the church and then hang it up on the wall next to this one. And in 100 years from now, have people say that, hey, that's when that church was really low in numbers. As they're going through the history, they said, that's when that church was really low in numbers. But guess what? That's the group of people right there, this group right here. That's the group that, boom, those numbers went back up. You know, if you noticed in that picture, I think there's more of us here today than there were in that picture. It's pretty close. But there's been times when this church has been way up there when there's been full pews from what I've heard from people. I wish Jan was here because he's been here for 69 years.